Have you ever had a day that was just too long? How about a week or a year that dragged on forever? Well, if that's your experience, imagine what it must have been like living through an entire century. And not just any century, mind you, but Rome's most fateful century, the 2nd century BCE, when Rome went from seemingly unstoppable to completely unrecognizable. So buckle up, because this is the story of Rome's century of change. And this is Chapter 1, The Price of Victory. Did I wake you? Sorry. Maybe I should have started with something softer. How about this? Deep in the heart of Italy, nestled between rolling hills and sun-kissed vineyards, there once stood a city unlike any other. A city of grand ambitions and even grander contradictions. We call it Rome. Still too much yelling. Let's try again. Imagine a Roman statesman looking out over the Mediterranean and seeing nothing but the blue expanse stretching as far as the eye can see. To him, this vast sea was a canvas upon which Rome had painted its victories, each stroke a testament to their might. But the sea wasn't just a reflection of Rome's power. It was also a silent witness to the weight of that power. For Rome's greatness, you see, was built on a foundation of inequality. A stark contrast between the opulence of the elites and the silent desperation of the many. It was a truth as undeniable as the aqueducts that brought water to the city, and as inescapable as the Colosseum that held its captive audience. Amidst this backdrop of triumph and disparity lived two brothers, Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus. Their story is our story. A tale of ideals and ambition, set against the grandeur and corruption of ancient Rome. You see, Gaius Tiberius were no ordinary Romans. They were born into the gens Gracchus, a family whose name echoed through the annals of Roman history. A lineage that traced its roots back to the very founding of the city. But their lineage wasn't just a source of pride. It was a burden, a constant reminder of the expectations that came with the Gracchus name. For their great-grandfather had been Marcus Livius Drusus, the last of the tribunes to champion the agrarian law, an attempt to reform Roman land ownership and address the growing gap between rich and poor, an attempt that had ended in bloodshed and the deaths of two of Drusus's sons. Now Gaius and Tiberius were carrying on their family's legacy in a Rome that had changed dramatically since the days of their great-grandfather. You see, Rome was at a crossroads, standing at the precipice of an era that would either solidify its position as a beacon of liberty and justice, or plunge it into the abyss of inequality and despair. But before we dive into their story, let's take a moment to understand the Rome they inhabited. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Rome had emerged as a dominant force in the Mediterranean, an empire that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the eastern shores of the Aegean Sea. Its legions had subdued fierce opponents like Carthage, Macedonia, and the Hellenistic kingdoms, leaving Rome as the undisputed mistress of the Mediterranean. This expansion, however, hadn't been a stroll in the park. The Punic Wars against Carthage and the Macedonian and Achaean conflicts had tested Rome's mettle, leaving deep scars on its soul. These victories, though celebrated in song and story, had come at a cost, both material and moral. The wars had drained Rome's treasury, and the relentless cycle of conquest and control was steadily eroding its traditional values. While Rome's coffers were filled with the spoils of war, its social fabric was fraying. The influx of cheap foreign labor had undercut local jobs. Farmers, the backbone of Roman society, were losing their land and becoming indebted. And the widening chasm between the rich and the poor threatened to tear the city apart. It was a paradox of epic proportions. Rome, the supposed champion of liberty and equality, was grappling with the same issues that plagued the very societies it had conquered. In the shadow of these colossal challenges, Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus emerged as unlikely heroes, idealistic young men determined to right the wrongs of their time. But they weren't just fighting against external forces. They were challenging the very core of Rome's identity, its values, traditions, and power structures. Their journey would lead them to confront some of the most powerful figures in Rome, to make enemies among the elite, and to pay a price that would echo through the ages. Now, imagine yourself sitting in the bustling Piazza Venezia in ancient Rome, surrounded by the murmurs of merchants and the clatter of chariot wheels. Before you stands the imposing Senate House, a symbol of Rome's aristocratic power. Here in this very spot, decisions were made that shaped not only the destiny of Rome, but also the course of Western civilization. Now picture two young men stepping out of their chariot, their faces etched with determination, their eyes fixed on the Senate House. These are our protagonists, Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus. Gaius the elder by a few years is a study in contrasts. Tall and athletic, with a commanding presence, he exudes an air of confidence that draws people in. His younger brother, Tiberius, is more reserved, his sharp intellect contrasting with his lean frame. Together, they form a formidable duo, a blend of charm and brains that has seen them navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics with surprising ease. But it's not just their individual traits that make them stand out. It's what binds them, their shared ideals, their unwavering commitment to justice, and their deep love for Rome. You see, these brothers weren't just ambitious politicians. They were idealists, men who believed in the power of the people and the promise of Rome's founding. They envisioned a Rome where the gap between the rich and the poor wasn't so wide, where the farmers who toiled on the land were unreduced to despair, and where the voice of the common man carried weight. Yet here they were, standing before the Senate House, ready to challenge the very institution that had perpetuated these inequalities for so long. As they ascend the steps towards the Senate House, a murmur ripples through the crowd. All eyes are on the Gracchus brothers, their every move scrutinized, their every word weighed. Inside the Senate House, the atmosphere is thick with anticipation. The senators, a class of aristocrats who had long held the reins of power, are a picture of stoic indifference. They're skeptical, amused, maybe even intrigued. But one thing they're not: prepared to let these brash young upstarts change the way Rome has always been run. As the brothers step into the Senate, the doors closing behind them, sealing their fate. The question is, can idealism survive in the world of Roman politics? Can one family really change the course of Rome's destiny? Or will they become just another casualty in the endless struggle for power? And now I pose these questions to you, dear viewer. What do you think? Can idealism truly thrive in the rough and tumble world of politics? And can one family, the Gracchus brothers, change the fate of a mighty empire like Rome? Share your thoughts. Your comments are the threads that weave our story together. As you ponder these questions, remember, every choice, every action has a consequence. The stage is set. The players are in position. Now it's time to see how the Gracchus brothers, Gaius and Tiberius, navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics. Will they emerge triumphant, or will they pay a heavy price for their ideals? Stay tuned to find out. Because in the world of ancient Rome, the road to victory is often paved with sacrifice, and the cost of progress can be steeper than anyone anticipates. Until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep watching. See you soon. Alright, let's do this. Chapter 2. Early Rome. If you know anything about ancient Rome, you probably know a lot about the emperors. You've heard about Augustus or Nero or Caligula, maybe even Marcus Aurelius. But what was Rome like before there was an Augustus or a Caesar? Well, before that, the Roman government was ruled by a group of people called the Senate, who were ostensibly the representatives of the whole Italian peninsula. In reality, however, the Senate was just a group of rich landowners who lived in Rome and had too much money because Rome didn't have a progressive tax system. And so a handful of people held most of the power. We call them the elites. The elites were able to maintain their power because Rome was built around the ideal that politics was something that only the smartest and most powerful could handle. It took a long time for a new law to be passed, and lots of people had to approve of it. This meant that if you weren't well off or well connected, you wouldn't have the free time or resources to get involved. So while theoretically anyone could become consul, the highest political office in Rome, practically speaking, it was near impossible, unless you were already from a wealthy and influential family. This is why one of the craziest things about the Gracchi family is that they weren't always wealthy and influential. Their story began in the small town of Venusia in southern Italy. Not much is known about them before we meet their mother, Cornelia. But what we do know about her gives us a good indication of how special her sons were destined to be. Cornelia was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, the man considered by many to be Rome's greatest general. He defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama and helped end the Second Punic War. He was also a humble man who didn't accept any pay for his military victories. Instead, he asked for donations for his soldiers and used the rest of the money to build temples and public works. When Scipio died, his estate was settled by his widow and Cornelia's mother, Livia, who found herself with a huge amount of wealth. Some people thought she squandered it, but this doesn't seem likely to me. She seems to have just given it away. In fact, she gave away so much that she got in trouble with the other elites for lowering property values. All we know about Cornelia comes from the writings of the Roman philosopher Plutarch, which means that our image of her is filtered through the lens of how Plutarch thought Romans should behave. so he probably exaggerated some of her best qualities. Still, based on what he says, Cornelia sounds like a saintly figure. A woman whose sole purpose was to raise her children to be virtuous and honorable Romans. She raised Tiberius and Gaius, her oldest sons, to believe that it was their duty to serve Rome and its people. According to Plutarch, she told them stories of famous Romans and emphasized the importance of living a life of service over one of material gain. When they were old enough, she sent them to a prestigious school in Athens, run by a Stoic philosopher named Attilos. After that, she brought them back home and hired private tutors to continue their education. But it was Cornelia who was their most important teacher. One day she called them into her bedroom to give them a demonstration in bravery. She was sick with an unknown illness and knew she was going to die. She wanted her boys to see her as she faced death, as she had seen her father do when he faced Hannibal in battle. She stripped down to a simple white robe, ignoring her pleas for comfortable clothes, and made her way onto her balcony. Standing on the edge, she asked her sons to imagine her as a ram caught between two rocks. Then she leaned forward slightly and asked them if they would save the ram. They said yes, of course. Then she dropped backwards dramatically, startling them. But then she just sat up and started laughing. She explained that she wasn't really falling, but wanted to see if they would leap in and help her. Tiberius ran to her and hugged her, but Gaius stood back. Cornelia was disappointed in him and called him out for not being brave. But Gaius responded that he would have saved her if she was really falling. And that's when Cornelia understood that her sons were ready to leave school and begin the next chapter of their lives. We don't know exactly when this happened, but both brothers were adults by the time they left home. Gaius was probably older, somewhere between 20 and 25. Around this time, Cornelia gave them an incredible gift, a villa in the countryside with beautiful gardens. This gift seems to have been an important part of growing up in the Gracchi family, as the brothers later gave the same gift to their own children. The villa was more than just a present. It was a symbol of Cornelia's values, a reminder to live a pure and simple life in the midst of nature. But Cornelia's influence in their lives didn't last forever. She died when Tiberius was 33, leaving him and Gaius alone in the world. The brothers honored her by giving her a magnificent funeral. This cost a fortune, but neither brother hesitated to spend the money. They may have actually profited from their mother's death, as her will stipulated that she wanted her estate to be divided equally among all her adult children. This meant that each of them received a gigantic sum of money. There's no way of knowing how this money changed Tiberius and Gaius, but it couldn't have hurt. In fact, they were now officially rich, and though they weren't born into the class of super rich like the Orsini or the Fabi, they were close enough that they could do whatever they wanted. For example, Tiberius decided to marry a woman named Sempronia, who was from one of the oldest and most respected families in Rome. This was a great match. Her father was consul during the Macedonian War, and her grandfather had served under Scipio Africanus at the Battle of Zama, so Sempronia came from a long line of powerful and successful Romans. And Tiberius must have looked like a good match for her as well. After all, he was about to become the most powerful man in Rome. You might think that I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I'm not. Tiberius was elected consul at the age of 34. It was the first year of the new century, and his campaign slogan was "Salvation through the Gracchi." His rise to power was meteoric, and it made him extremely popular. However, it also made him enemies. One of those enemies would soon take everything away from him. But I'll get to that. For now, let's focus on what made the Gracchi so special. I think it was a combination of three things. First, they had access to the best education Rome had to offer, and used it to learn everything about how the government worked. Second, they had the example of their mother, who taught them the importance of honesty and integrity in public life. Third, they had a reason to use their power. Unlike many of their peers who were content with the status quo, the Gracchi believed that Rome wasn't working for the average citizen, and they wanted to fix it. However, these three factors weren't enough to keep them safe. There was a fourth force at play, an almost magical quality that seemed to draw the worst out of people. You can feel it in the writing of Plutarch, who frequently mentions how amazing the Gracchi were. And you can see it in the way they conducted themselves, the way they acted without fear. What I'm trying to say is that the Gracchi were destined for greatness, but they were also destined for conflict. And that conflict would begin with the murder of one of Rome's greatest generals. Okay, that's the end of part 3. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. If you did, please subscribe and leave me a review. And remember, you can support me directly by following the links below. Thanks, bye. We've said it before and we'll say it again. Rome did not make the best first impressions. But sometimes those first impressions can be deceiving. Take, for instance, the city of Numantia in Spain. When it fell to Rome after a brutal 3-year siege in 133 BC, the spoils of war were considerable, with the Romans taking an estimated 10,000 prisoners and seizing vast amounts of gold and silver. It was quite the victory. And yet that victory would cast a long shadow over one Gaius, Tiberius Gracchus. Welcome back to the channel. This is chapter 3 of our series on the Gracchi brothers, where we'll look at how Tiberius got his start in politics. If you're new here, remember to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode. You can also check us out on our website or support us through various platforms. Tiberius had been in the army for 16 years now, fighting in the most important campaigns of his generation. He was there when Rome crushed the last embers of Carthage in the Punic War, and he fought alongside Scipio Aemilianus in Spain against the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca, eventually capturing the city of Saguntum and laying siege to Numantia. It wasn't just because he was related to the great Marius that Tiberius saw action. He earned his stripes, rising through the ranks from optio, which is sort of like an assistant centurion, all the way up to military tribune. He was known for being fair, disciplined, and devoted to his men. But what really made Tiberius stand out was the speech he gave to his fellow officers right before the fall of Numantia. It was a dark moment. The Romans were victorious, but the terms of surrender demanded every inhabitant be put to death, including women and children. Even Hannibal's mother, the famous Carthaginian noblewoman and spy Hannibal Barca, who had been living in the city, was ordered killed, along with everyone else. There was no quarter for Numantia. The order came directly from the Roman Senate. But even though Tiberius was himself responsible for executing several hundred Numantian nobles, he couldn't bring himself to participate in a massacre of innocents. And so in his famous speech, which Plutarch tells us was both powerful and moving, Tiberius appealed to his fellow officers to mutiny and defy the Senate's orders. While they didn't follow through with him, Tiberius lost favor with the Roman authorities for his sympathy towards the Numantines, an event that deeply troubled him for the rest of his life. Following his service in Spain, Tiberius spent a few years running his farm, which he had inherited from his father, a wealthy senator named Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. But soon enough, he was called back into service to fight another war against the same Carthaginians. This time he followed the brilliant general Gaius Marius to Africa, where the two became close friends and allies. During this campaign, they managed to capture several towns, including the strategically important city of Utica. As the Roman legions swept through the countryside, Tiberius was shocked at the misery he witnessed. Farms lay abandoned, fields were burned, and entire villages were wiped out. It was a complete devastation. And while normally booty and plunder were distributed among the troops, this time there was nothing to take. The Carthaginians had either looted their own property or left it in ruins. And so as they marched on to the final siege of Carthage, the soldiers complained bitterly about the lack of pay and provisions. Soon enough, some began to grumble about Tiberius, blaming him for the army's hardships. But Tiberius, always popular with the common soldiers, was able to turn things around by organizing a distribution of grain from the little food he was able to salvage from captured cities. By the end of the Third Punic War, then Rome was victorious once more. But Tiberius was disillusioned with the destruction he had seen firsthand during the campaign. He knew that war was expensive, and that war profiteers often enriched themselves off the backs of the poor, who were the ones who suffered most from the violence and destruction. In fact, he had seen this happen firsthand when he was a young man, and his father bought a farm in southern Italy. Tiberius was helping to survey the land when he saw a nearby farm completely destroyed, its fields trampled underfoot and its crops left to rot. When he asked why the farm had been neglected, he learned that it belonged to a soldier who had gone off to fight in the Social War. That's the war between Rome and its Italian allies. But while he was away, land grabbers known as the vested castrati had seized his farm and left it abandoned because it was unprofitable. And so when the soldier returned, defeated and impoverished, there was no farm left for him to go back to. That experience planted a seed in young Tiberius, a seed that grew into an obsession with social justice and inequality. In fact, that event from his youth may have been the catalyst for the agrarian reform movement that would eventually consume him. It wasn't the only time that Tiberius witnessed such injustice. During his long military career, he repeatedly saw poor farmers get squeezed by Rome's elite class. When Rome finally captured the city of Carthage in 146 BC, it was utterly devastated. The legendary Roman writer Cicero described how the city was a scene of indescribable misery, with houses in ruins, fields untended, roads overgrown, and everywhere the traces of utter devastation. Entire regions of North Africa, Cicero wrote, had been turned into barren wastelands, and the people of Carthage, who were famed throughout the ancient world for their wealth and refinement, were now reduced to begging for scraps. Rome's treatment of Carthage disgusted Tiberius, who saw the terrible cost of war firsthand and realized that the rich got richer while the poor got poorer. When he retired from the army after more than 20 years of service, he decided to do something about it. But how could one man hope to challenge the most powerful class in Rome? Well, for Tiberius, it wasn't really a choice. It was a calling. He believed that he owed it to the soldiers who died under his command, as well as to the countless poor people he saw suffer and die, to try to make things right. So he ran for the office of tribune of the plebs, a position in ancient Rome, originally created to protect the interests of the common people. Not only was it the lowest office in the Republic, it was also considered a stepping stone to higher office. But for Tiberius, that wasn't the point. He had no interest in becoming a senator or a consul. All he wanted was the power that came with the tribune's office, to push through reforms that would help the poor and the landless. However, he soon discovered that the path to reform was a lot longer and harder than he expected. So stay tuned next week for Chapter 4, where we'll see how Tiberius's reforms shook Rome to its core. And if you want to get more from us, you can check out our website. We've egoed everything from maps to timelines to a guide on how to pronounce all the names in this series. Speaking of which, we'd love to know what you think. What do you think of Tiberius? Let us know down in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to show your support. We'll see you next time. The Roman Republic is being torn apart by the agrarian crisis. Large estates called latifundia are taking over and kicking off the small farmers. We've been following the story of Tiberius Gracchus, a young man who has come to Rome to seek his fortune. But when he gets there, he finds that the corruption of the ruling elite is so bad that it will take a miracle to fix. Will Tiberius be able to do it? Find out in Chapter 4, Land and Justice. Tiberius arrives in Rome during a particularly brutal round of the agrarian crisis, the displacement of small farmers by large estates known as latifundia. While he's staying with his uncle, he learns that his father has died back in the province. And if Tiberius wants to inherit his estate, he must return home immediately to manage it. But before he does, he attends the funeral games held in honor of his father, an important social event that gives the young nobleman a chance to meet influential people. It's also a reminder that he belongs to the equestrian order, not the Senate. He is a member of the second most powerful class in Roman society, but still far from the top. At the funeral games, Tiberius meets two old friends of his father. They ask him why he doesn't put his name forward for the election of tribune of the plebs, one of two positions, along with tribune of the soldiers, which make up the two most powerful offices in the entire republic. Tribune of the plebs is an annual appointment. In theory, this office was created to protect the interests of the common people against the power of the patrician class. So far, only members of the patrician class had ever served in this role. But many tribunes had enacted beneficial reforms for the poor. Most recently, the tribune of last year had established the Lex Licinia Sextia, a law that redistributed public land to the poor. But this law was opposed by the Senate, who argued that it infringed on private property rights, and it never really went into effect. This made Tiberius think about the plight of the poor. Maybe becoming tribune of the plebs would give him the opportunity to help them. He tells his friends that he'll think about it. Tiberius returns to his villa in the country, where he sees firsthand how the latifundia system is ruining the lives of the small farmers. After settling his affairs, he heads back to Rome and runs for the office of tribune of the plebs. Being elected is easy for a young man of his status. The real work starts now. Tiberius begins by putting together a list of all the people who don't have enough land to support themselves. 80,000 people in all, nearly 1 out of every 5 Romans. But what can he do for them? The Lex Licinia Sextia established that anyone who didn't own enough land to support themselves could petition the tribune of the plebs to receive public land, which would be taken from temples or from large estates that had been left uncultivated. The latifundia owners simply ignored this law. Tiberius wants to change that. He drafts a new law, but unlike anything seen before, it's bold, sweeping legislation that will redistribute all public land to the poor. All citizens who don't own enough land will get as much as they need to support themselves. To pay for this, Tiberius plans to tax the large estates, especially those that had been left uncultivated. Finally, no more would the rich be able to benefit from the labor of others. They would finally be punished for leaving their land barren. But the law does not stop there. It would also punish anyone who hoarded slaves. If a landowner had more than 200 slaves, he would be taxed for every one over that number. This money would go to pay the poor, making them less dependent on their masters. The idea of helping the poor excites the imagination of the people, but it terrifies the elite. Before he can introduce his law, Tiberius must get the approval of the Senate. But he knows that the Senate will never approve of his plan. The Senate is dominated by aristocrats who own large estates and hordes of slaves. They are horrified at the thought of losing their wealth and power. When Tiberius submits his plan to the Senate, it is rejected unanimously. The crafty old men who run Rome have found a way to crush the reformer before he even gets started. But Tiberius is not done fighting. He realizes that the Senate holds all the power in the Republic. But the power ultimately comes from the people. If he can convince the people that the Senate is corrupt and that he is their champion, then the people might rise up and support him. He goes to the Forum Romanum, the center of political life in ancient Rome, and addresses the crowd. He passionately argues that the Senate is dominated by a handful of rich landowners who care only about themselves. Under their control, Italy has become the most unequal place in the world. Farms have been abandoned, while thousands starve in the cities. These senators are destroying the very foundation of Rome. It is time for a change. The speech angers the senators who are lounging nearby. They try to stop Tiberius from speaking, but it's too late. His words have inspired the people. For the first time, ordinary Romans are beginning to see that they have a champion. Tiberius asks them to trust him, to give him the power to enact his reforms. And they do. He becomes the most popular politician in Rome, and the senators fear he may become too powerful. In a desperate move to stop Tiberius, the consul Cato Minor accuses him of plotting to seize power. The charge is false, but the timing couldn't be worse. The Senate declares Tiberius an enemy of the state and orders his arrest. He barely manages to escape and flees to the countryside. The Senate has just committed political murder, and the people of Rome are furious. There's only one thing left for Tiberius to do. He marches on Rome with an army. Along the way, he gains supporters. His popularity grows as he gains more and more momentum. Finally, he stands before the gate of the city. He could easily enter and seize power, but he doesn't. He doesn't want to be a tyrant. Instead, he reminds the Romans that their power is greater than any army. Together, they can save the Republic. He asks them to let him in without his army. Alone, he walks through the gates of Rome to face the Senate. When he enters the Senate, the air is thick with tension. All eyes are on him. What will he do? Will he seize power? Or will he find another way to bring about reform? As he looks around the chamber, he sees that the crafty old men who have dominated Rome for so long are afraid. He knows that he has the power to make real change in the Republic. He doesn't need to be a king to do it. After talking with some of the more moderate senators, Tiberius is convinced that there is still hope for the Republic. He can bring about real reform without starting a civil war. But this will require a compromise. Tiberius agrees to drop his plan to redistribute land to the poor. In exchange, the Senate will allow him to establish colonies of small farmers on public land, far from the reach of the latifundia owners. It's not the land reform that Tiberius originally envisioned, but it's a start. With the support of the people, Tiberius has forced the Senate to make concessions. He has shown that it's possible to fight the establishment and win. The colonies are established and the poor begin to leave Rome to start new lives as independent farmers. The crisis is averted, at least for now. But Tiberius knows that the battle for a better Rome has just begun. He has proved that a single man can stand up to the establishment and win. But can he do it again and again? That's what we'll find out in the next chapter. Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. There's lots more adventures of Tiberius coming up, including the assassination of Caesar. Chapter 5. The Fall of Tiberius. The plot thickens in this week's episode. Gaius, nicknamed Caligula, is now Emperor of Rome, and he doesn't like people controlling the city while he is away on military campaigns. He especially doesn't like his own grandmother, Julia Maesa, and that's a problem because she's the mother of two very powerful men. One is Balbillus, who controls the Praetorian Guard. The other is Tiberius, who controls Rome itself. But don't worry, because in addition to being emperor, Caligula is also a friend of the people. See, earlier in his reign, he reduced taxes by a full 50%. Everyone loved it. Everyone except the treasury, of course. So now he is going to play up the part of friend of the people by taking away the power of Tiberius, who he believes is holding Rome hostage. But don't worry, Tiberius will live to fight another day, right? You know, unless he gets stabbed or shot or beheaded or crucified or gored by an elephant tusk. In which case, well, there's always next week. Our story begins with Caligula back in Rome after a short jaunt to Gaul. There he had met with his friend, Lucius alias Sejanus. If you remember him from previous episodes, he was the guy Caligula made commander of the Praetorian Guard. And if you don't, then hey, welcome back to Rome, where every day seems like the first day unless you were executed by the previous Emperor Augustus. Then every day is exactly the same as the last because you're dead. Anyway, Sejanus was ostensibly in charge of the Praetorians, but really he was in charge of everything, including Rome itself. Or, to put it in modern terms, he was the guy Caligula called whenever he needed something done, even though technically he was unsupposed to have that much power. Like when Augustus designated Tiberius to be the governor of Rome, he tried to keep the Praetorian Guard out of city politics. You see, that's what they were for, guarding the emperor when he left the city. It's why their barracks were outside the city walls. Although Augustus did allow them to have a few buildings inside the city, they were mostly used as storage facilities for the legionnaires' pay. Which was handy because it meant the Praetorians didn't have to march all the way to the barracks if they wanted to get paid. It also meant that if the emperor was in danger, they could protect him without having to march all the way to the barracks, which would take like half an hour or something. So that worked out pretty well for everyone involved. Except now Caligula is emperor, and he wants to change things. Like for example, he wants to put one of his friends in charge of Rome instead of Sejanus. That might seem perfectly reasonable to us, but in Rome it was unheard of. The emperor didn't have friends, so no one expected him to put one of his friends in charge of Rome. Plus, that friend happened to be Gaius Asinius Pallio, who just so happened to be the brother of the woman Caligula was sleeping with. But maybe most importantly, Pallio was a senator, which in Rome meant you couldn't really trust yourself around sharp objects. Now, senators loved nothing more than getting together and complaining about how the good old days were better than now. Back in the good old days, Rome was ruled by kings. And since kings were always conveniently male, they assumed that must mean women weren't smart enough to rule. So naturally, when they got the chance to vote themselves into power, they created a republic. However, the senators still missed having someone else take care of all the hard decisions, so they made the consuls, or chief executives, as powerful as kings, except instead of calling them king, they called them princeps, which literally meant first citizen. But when the republic became an empire, the title stayed. And here's the rub. Augustus was the first emperor, which made him the first citizen. And now his stepson, Tiberius, held that same title. In reality, that title didn't mean anything. It was just a bit of name window dressing. But in Rome, symbols mattered. The senators believed that if Tiberius was the princeps, then he was actually Augustus's equal, or at least close enough that he shouldn't be demoted by some random senator. And even worse, Pallio was already a princeps. Once he was consul, he lost that title. But if Caligula appointed him governor of Rome, then he would have the title again, which meant that there were now two princepses. Of course, that was ridiculous. There could only be one princeps, which meant either Tiberius had to lose the title or become the actual first citizen. So Caligula decided to cut out the middleman. When he returned to Rome, he went straight to the Senate and demanded they give him the power to appoint governors without their approval. After all, he argued, he was the princeps, the first citizen, and the senators should be honored to lend their titles to the emperor's friends. Now, this wasn't a new idea. Augustus had asked the Senate to confirm his choices, but he never forced them, and the Senate agreed to all but 3 of his choices. Tiberius, however, had been a thorn in the side of the Republic for so long that they rejected him outright. Tiberius was furious, but before he could react, Caligula seized the Palatine Hill, the part of Rome where both the emperor and the Senate lived, along with most of the city's population. The senators fled to the nearby Capitoline Hill and organized a mob. They called for Tiberius and his Praetorian cohorts to be removed from office, demanding the Senate have final say in choosing governors. And just like that, the situation escalated into a full-blown crisis. Tiberius was surrounded and outnumbered, but he had one advantage: his bodyguard. He had brought 24 of his Praetorian cohorts with him to the meeting, which probably seemed like overkill at the time, but now came in handy. He ordered them to seize the Forum and the Senate House, effectively blocking the city center. Now it was Caligula who was surrounded. His residence was on the Palatine Hill, along with his sister Drusilla and her husband, the aforementioned Pallio. Now, history tells us that Tiberius refused to give up peacefully. He knew he was outnumbered, but he was willing to die rather than let some upstart senator tell him what to do. Unfortunately, the sources also tell us that Tiberius was wrong. According to them, he surrendered immediately. However, I think they're just telling us that because Tiberius surrendering immediately means everyone goes home happy. And happy endings make everyone feel warm and fuzzy inside, which is good for business. Also, it lets the author avoid writing a sequel, so it's likely Tiberius fought to the death. Either way, the next morning, a delegation arrived at the Palatine Hill to tell Tiberius that his services were no longer required, but when they arrived, they found the place abandoned. Someone had slipped a note under the door informing the Praetorians that Tiberius had resigned. With their leader gone, the Praetorians opened the gates and escorted the senators off the hill. Then they did the same for the imperial family. As they marched across the forum, they passed by the rostra, or speaker's platform, where Tiberius had given so many speeches over the years. Now someone approached him, allegedly a senator named L. Minucius Faustus. I'm sorry, I couldn't pronounce that, and drew his dagger and plunged it into Tiberius's chest. Tiberius staggered back, clutching his chest, fell down the stairs of the rostra and onto the street below, where he bled to death. It's important to note that according to the sources, Faustus wasn't trying to kill Tiberius. He just wanted to scare him. But whatever the truth, Tiberius was dead, and we can only assume he felt betrayed by the people he thought he was protecting. Either way, he died that day with dozens of his Praetorian cohorts, and soon the streets of Rome ran red with the blood of not just Tiberius, but hundreds of his supporters. This was the first major bloodshed in Roman politics, a foreshadowing of what was to come. And we may never know how many died that day, but it's safe to say it was more than 300. Asinius Pallio managed to escape to Asia Minor, where he died of natural causes. Balbillus took his own life, and Julia Maesa survived to run Rome with her son, Claudius, who eventually became emperor himself. As for Caligula, he got what he wanted. The Senate approved all of his appointments, but soon grew tired of him humiliating them in public. That's our story for next week. In the meantime, I'm the host. You can follow me on social media, and don't forget to check out our support page to help keep the series running. Until next time. Chapter 6. The Rise of Gaius Gracchus. The year is 123 BCE. Nearly a decade has passed since the death of Tiberius Gracchus. Rome's streets have quieted down since those violent clashes between populares and optimates. And Gaius has been keeping a low profile, honing his skills in the provinces, strengthening his political network, and waiting for the right moment to step back into the public stage. Now that moment has come. In this episode, we'll see how Gaius reinvented himself after the tribuneship of his father and used that experience to launch his own political career. The year before, in 124, Lucius Mummius had defeated King Perseus of Macedon at the Battle of Pydna. This was Rome's most decisive victory to date, ending the Macedonian and the Third Punic Wars as decisively as the Second did Carthage. Greece was now part of the Roman world, yet few Romans saw this as anything but a burden. Greece seemed exotic, its people degenerate, its cities decadent. Many, like the historian Polybius, worried about the effects that Greek culture would have on Rome. As an antidote, Rome needed strong traditionalists at the helm, men who would keep things in order. These were the optimates, conservatives, who believed that Rome's institutions and customs should be maintained intact. It was no surprise then when two former consuls, the Scipionic father and son duo of Publius and Gnaeus Cornelius, were appointed to govern the new province of Macedonia. It was here in the east that Gaius honed his skills as an administrator, learning from his experienced uncle and getting a taste of power for himself. Returning to Rome in 129, he was elected to one of the lesser magistrate positions, the military tribune. But by all accounts, he distinguished himself with the task, proving to be energetic, competent, and ambitious. 2 years later, it was time for him to run for the office of tribune of the plebs, the first step on the cursus honorum, the traditional path to the top offices of the Roman state. And if you think it's weird that he skipped over the minor offices in between, trust me, it was even weirder in ancient Rome. We may never know exactly why he skipped the lower offices, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that he got the support of his uncle and possibly other influential figures. It wasn't personal connections, but rather their belief in his abilities that made this possible. He was far from your typical young Roman aristocrat. To be sure, he was handsome and charismatic, but his looks alone would not have secured him election. He was also naturally more fiery than most patricians. In fact, while he was in the army in Greece, he had actually gotten into a fight with one of his centurions and killed him. Normally that would be a problem, but it turned out the centurion was a bully, and Gaius had defended one of his fellow soldiers. So there you have it. Unlike many of his peers, Gaius wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty or to speak his mind. But what really set him apart was his skill as an orator. His ability to sway hearts and minds, a skill he likely developed through his study of Greek rhetoric. Most importantly though, he was a strategic thinker, able to connect the dots and see the big picture. He knew that Rome's problems ran deeper than the loss of the Gracchus brothers. A lot of people thought that Rome could go back to business as usual, that everything would just work out fine. And to an extent, they were right. Rome would continue to expand and prosper for decades. But Gaius knew that unless Rome's fundamental problems were addressed, she wouldn't last much longer, and he was right. Let's start with the economy. Rome was accumulating unprecedented wealth, but that wealth was concentrated in the hands of an elite few, leaving the majority of the population, both in Rome and throughout the empire, in poverty. Add to that the strain of so many soldiers coming home after decades of constant warfare. It was a ticking time bomb. Most importantly, though, was the land. You see, ever since Rome conquered Italy, it had grown accustomed to taking land from conquered enemies and giving it to its veterans. That's how Rome's early republic grew and flourished. But now Rome was an imperial state. It had taken land from Carthage, Greece, and beyond. There were no more major states around to conquer. Yet veterans continued to return from the provinces every year. Where were they supposed to go? Since the land had long been owned by wealthy individuals or large estates, Rome didn't have the resources to give away anymore. And so veterans were left to fend for themselves, joining the ranks of the urban poor. And it wasn't just veterans. As the empire expanded, more and more small farmers were being pushed off their land. Large estates were scooping up small farms, unable to compete with the economies of scale that larger farms could manage. This process was happening all over the Mediterranean, but it was especially acute in Italy. More and more people were coming to Rome looking for jobs or land, only to find themselves competing for scarce resources with the dispossessed veterans. How could Rome solve these problems? Well, Gaius had some ideas. His main rival was a certain Marcus Octavius, a patrician who had held several important offices. He was well liked by the people, but lacked any real charisma. In contrast, Gaius could rally crowds with ease, connecting with them emotionally and speaking their language. And that is exactly what he did when he gave his first speech on the platform of the Forum, the very spot where his father had died nearly a decade earlier. Gaius told the people that their quality of life was degrading, that their hardships were if only Rome would address her wounds, she would heal and become stronger than ever. But instead of focusing on a single wound, Gaius had a whole kit of policy proposals ready to go, and his agenda was nothing if not ambitious. Let's talk about land reform, because that's the thing most people remember about Gaius, and rightly so. The plan was simple. Any farm holding more than 300 acres would be reduced to 300 acres, with the excess land redistributed to the landless. But that wasn't all. His agenda included grain subsidies for the poor so that they wouldn't starve, colonies to send Rome's poor to the far-flung corners of the empire, judicial reform to fix the broken legal system. But none of this would have worked without his final piece, a strong central government. Unlike the traditional Roman Republic with its weak executive, Gaius wanted a strong executive, someone to get things done. He knew that Rome's survival depended on it. But not everyone was thrilled with his agenda. Sure, land reform had broad support, but his other proposals were far more controversial. And there were plenty of powerful people, the landowners, the old-school senators, who would suffer under his reforms. They preferred the status quo. With the support of these influential groups, Octavius tried to paint Gaius as a demagogue, as a dangerous radical who would destroy Rome's traditions and way of life. But Gaius turned this to his advantage, arguing that his opponents were afraid of change, afraid of making Rome better. It was a brilliant strategy. Now the crowd didn't care about tradition, they wanted results. And Gaius promised results. On election day, he won by a landslide, securing 38% of the vote and becoming the most popular politician in Rome. In fact, it was so bad for his opponents that Octavius had to flee to the countryside to escape the mobs. Soon Gaius was marching through the forum with his bodyguard, not carrying a dagger like Tiberius had, but a club, the symbol of his authority as tribune. It was time to start the revolution. Join us next time as Gaius begins his tribunate by going straight after the Senate. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or a super thanks on our support page. Music by Epidemic Sound. Thanks to my supporters for making this video possible. In Chapter 6, we saw how Gaius Marius transformed Rome from within. He cleaned up the army and made it the most powerful force in the Mediterranean. But while he was successful on the battlefield, back in Rome, he had a much more difficult task. The wealthier class, the elite that controlled Rome, were getting steadily more resentful of Gaius's growing power, and they wanted him gone. But Gaius wasn't ready to leave just yet. Not only did he want to finish the job that he started, he wanted to change Rome forever. So, with the backing of the populares, he began the process of reforming the very structure of Roman government. And in Chapter 7, we're going to see if he succeeded. If you're new here, welcome to my channel, where we explore the amazing history of ancient Rome. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Rome in 107 BCE was a city divided. On one hand, you had people like Gaius, who believed that the government should do more to help the struggling poor, who argued that Rome was being held back by its rigid social hierarchy. On the other hand, you had the aristocratic elite, people like Marcus Crassus, who didn't want the government getting involved in anything that would threaten their power and privilege. And right now, these two sides were on a collision course. After winning his third consulship in 107, Gaius continued his efforts to improve the lives of the Roman poor, starting with the grain supply. In the past, Rome's grain supply came entirely from its Italian allies. But this created an unfortunate situation. As Cassius Dio puts it, the Italians, which is what Romans called the non-citizens, suffered bitterly when the supply of grain fell short, since it was forced to be exported to Rome. And thus they were reduced to the last and worst of far from plentiful rations. And indeed, without enough grain to go around, prices would skyrocket, meaning that even the middle class would sometimes struggle to afford food. So, in 104, Gaius decided to do something about it. He instituted a program that subsidized grain for the poor, paying out of his own pocket to ensure that everyone had enough to eat. This was actually pretty similar to what Augustus would do after he took power, except that Gaius was doing it years in advance, and without any imperial backing. But there was a bigger problem than simply buying grain. The thing was, many Romans were too poor to even cook the grain once they got it home. So, in 103, Gaius passed another law that addressed that issue. It assigned 3/4 of the public land, the land owned by the Roman state, to be redistributed among the landless poor, which would not only give them a place to live, but also a way to feed themselves. Now, you might think that this would be a popular reform, helping the poor and all, but it actually ended up angering a lot of people because this land wasn't empty. It was actually farmed by tenant farmers who paid rent to the Roman state. And some of these tenants were quite wealthy. In fact, some historians believe that Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, got his start by farming public land. So taking away their farms didn't make Gaius very popular with the upper class. Still, Gaius kept pushing forward, passing colony laws that established settlements throughout Italy, Gaul, and even Africa. One of these colonies ended up being Carthage, which at the time was nothing but a collection of tents. But under Gaius's plan, it would become a full-fledged Roman colony, complete with a forum and temples. And although this sounds great, it didn't go over very well with the Carthaginians, who viewed Romans as cultural inferiors. They complained to their overlords in the east, and eventually, thanks to the efforts of the pro-Carthaginian Scipio Africanus, Rome agreed to cancel the colony plans. But Gaius wasn't done with Carthage just yet. You'll have to wait until episode 53 to hear how he brought the colony plan back from the dead. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Gaius knew that his biggest challenge wasn't the poor or the foreign nations, it was the Senate. Ever since he first took office, he'd been systematically stripping the Senate of its power, putting loyal supporters in positions of authority, shifting courts away from corrupt senators, and handing political offices directly to the people. And this trend continued into his fourth consulship, this time by cracking down on extortion. Now, extortion wasn't anything new or shocking in Roman politics. In fact, it was practically expected. When a magistrate, a governor, or a senator went to do a job, whether it was collecting taxes, running a province, or administering justice, They were legally allowed to supplement their income by accepting bribes. Basically, if someone could get a kickback from a deal, they were free to take it. And the higher up you were, the more you got. So the best way to get rich in Roman politics was to be a judge and to use your position to shake down criminals. You could fine them, imprison them, or if you really wanted to, you could have them put to death. And then you could take their stuff. That's exactly what happened to Gaius Tiberius, who was so corrupt as the governor of Sicily that Gaius dedicated his 5th consulship to prosecuting him for his crimes. And as Livy puts it, he did not shrink from bringing the greatest of the senators before the people in the courts of justice. Now, while this sounds like it helped clean up corruption in Rome, the truth was more complicated. As I explained in my last video, Gaius used the Tiberius trial to push through a law that would essentially allow future judges to double their salaries. So yes, he punished one corrupt judge, but he also made it easier for others to follow in his footsteps. And Gaius didn't stop there. He also fought to end the rigged elections that determined who got to serve in public office. For example, he tried to limit how much money candidates could spend on campaigning and sought to ban large-scale bribery. But his attempts to reform the elections ultimately failed. And in 102, the results of the voting were so chaotic that they had to be cancelled altogether. It was the worst electoral crisis in Roman history, so with every new reform, Gaius was making more enemies in the Senate, but he didn't care. In fact, he welcomed the fight. He believed that Rome needed to be changed, even if it meant angering the elite. Unfortunately, though, not everyone shared his enthusiasm. After suffering a serious injury in battle, Gaius's health was rapidly deteriorating, and he struggled to get out of bed each morning. Plutarch tells us that he often asked himself, "Is this what my life has come to? Am I just another old man?" And perhaps those questions are what led him to finally compromise. For the first time in his career, Gaius decided to make his reforms part of a formal program. The Lex Plotia Papiria, named after the 2 men who sponsored it, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus and Lucius Papirius Cursa, and it was revolutionary. It combined all of Gaius's past reforms into one cohesive system. First, it legalized and expanded upon his grain program, making sure that Rome would always have enough food to eat. Next, it formalized the redistribution of public land, guaranteeing a place to live and farm for the landless poor. Then it codified his criminal trial reforms, ensuring fair trials and due process for all Romans. Finally, it reformed the elections so that they would be free from bribery and corruption. But despite his best efforts, the Lex Plotia Papiria didn't pass. Sure, the voting was fair, but the outcome was still predetermined. The Senate simply voted no. And in response, Gaius did what he could to push through his agenda on his own. He continued to appoint loyal magistrates, reorganized the courts, rewrote laws and cracked down on corruption, hoping to accomplish through force what he couldn't accomplish through legislation. And this strategy worked for a while, but it bred resentment as well. The upper class started to feel like Gaius was a tyrant trying to rule by decree. And even some of Gaius's allies thought he was going too far. Eventually, his friend and ally, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, decided to draw a line. He marched into the Forum with a group of armed supporters, shut down the assembly, kicked out Gaius, and seized control of Rome. To find out how Sulla seized power, and why he immediately turned on his former ally, stay tuned for Chapter 8. Hey there, I just wanted to let you know that if you enjoyed this video, you can watch the next chapter right now. My videos are normally released one at a time and weekly, but Chapter 8 is already available exclusively on our app. And not only can you watch the next episode early, but you can also watch all of our past episodes, ad-free, and without any sponsorships. Plus, you'll get exclusive content that you can't find anywhere else, including a mini-series on the fall of the Roman Empire. If you want to check it out, go to our website, or click the link in the description below. Gaius is being portrayed as a threat to the very existence of the Roman Republic. Every time he enters the Senate, he's surrounded by armed tribunes and senators fear for their lives. His most recent proposal, a drastic reduction of land owned by the wealthy in favor of the poor, has been defeated, but his allies are threatening a veto. So with things looking so bleak, what will Gaius do next? Find out in this episode of Rome, Emperor Caesar. It's me. Welcome to my channel, where we tell the stories of ancient Rome in a new way. Today we continue our series covering the rise and fall of Gaius Gracchus and the events surrounding his untimely demise. If you haven't already, please be sure to check out Chapter 7, which covers Gaius's attempts to reform the Roman Senate and land ownership. In the last episode, we ended with Gaius using the tribunes to carry out an unconstitutional census, one that would allow him to confiscate land from the wealthy, redistribute it to the poor, and finally end Rome's cycle of poverty and war. This was obviously a huge issue for the optimates, or the best men, Rome's elite class of landowners. They feared losing their wealth and status, and while the populares, or the people's men, were largely behind Gaius's reforms, they weren't happy about how he went about doing it. Gaius was treading on dangerous ground. He was using the patrician assemblies to pass legislation that was completely against the interest of the patricians. It wasn't subtle, and they were watching him closely. After defeating Gaius's land reform, the Senate now had enough reason to paint him as a demagogue, one who was trying to use the common folk to destroy Rome's institutions and traditions. Even though the voting results showed that much of the Roman populace was against the reform, the optimates used the veto as often as they could to block any further reforms from being passed. Gaius, however, didn't seem to care and continued with his radical proposals, including a plan to redistribute grain from Roman holdings in Sicily to the poor in Rome. This enraged the optimates, and they knew they had to stop him, even if it meant using underhanded tactics. The Roman Senate was created over 200 years before Gaius's time, and it was designed to be slow and deliberate in its actions. Senators could debate for hours, and even days before coming to a decision. This was good when everyone more or less agreed on the outcome, but terrible when there was a crisis and swift action was required. In times like these, the Senate would pass something called a senatus consultum ultimum, or last decree, which granted emergency powers to an official or magistrate to deal with whatever crisis the Republic was facing. Usually this sort of thing only lasted for a year at most, but in Gaius's case, it was different. The optimates were terrified of what Gaius might do next. So in 133 BCE, they passed the senatus consultum ultimum and gave absolute power to a group of 3 commissioners, one of whom was Marcus Junius Brutus, the father of the famous Marcus Junius Brutus. The commissioners were given the power to do whatever it took to protect the state. They could use violence, make arrests, and even execute anyone they deemed a threat, without the formality of a trial. In effect, the Senate had just declared war on Gaius Gracchus and his followers. Gaius wasn't stupid, and he knew he was in danger. For the first time since entering politics, he took a defensive stance, levying an army of 4,000 men to defend himself and his followers. On the opposite side was the Senate's force of 6,000 men, led by none other than Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the man who once saved Gaius's life. He had no choice but to fight for the Senate, not because he wanted to, but because he owed his career to the optimates. This civil war between the populares and the optimates would go down in history as the first of many, and it started just like the others, with street battles. During the day, Gaius and his followers rioted through the streets of Rome, fighting against Sulla's men and anyone who opposed them. Most of the violence happened at night, though, in the dark alleys and marketplaces where small groups of Gaius's supporters would ambush Sulla's men. Food vendors became impromptu armories, their knives and carts used as makeshift weapons. While Gaius fought valiantly, it soon became clear that the Senate had too much support. The Romans loved their traditions, and they weren't about to let some upstart destroy them. Gaius was slowly pushed back into the center of Rome, closer and closer to the Tiber River. One day, as Gaius was walking back to the Forum after a failed attack on the capital, he saw the Ponte Sisto, a bridge that would lead him to safety across the river, blocked by Sulla's men. He was trapped. As night fell, Gaius and his remaining 1,000 men retreated to the Aventine Hill. With them were 120 of the 350 members of the Assembly of the Plebs, along with Gaius's brother Tiberius and his mother Cornelia. With the hill just a few blocks away, Gaius thought he had a chance. All he needed to do was get through the night and regroup in the morning. But what happened next was unthinkable. One of Gaius's own generals, Lucius Mummius, who had recently switched sides, opened the gates to the Aventine for Sulla. As Mummius's men poured in, Gaius grabbed a sword and shield and fought to the death alongside his brother and his mother. Both of his brothers died in the fighting, one killed by a rock thrown from a catapult, the other executed by Mummius's men. And as Cornelia fell dying in front of him, Gaius knew it was time to go. He ran onto the roof of a nearby house and jumped onto the statue of a horse, which just so happened to be pointing toward the Ponte Sisto. It was his only way out. As he neared the bridge, a woman named Artinia, who was waiting on the far side to collect intelligence for Sulla, shouted, "Hey Gaius, jump into my arms." Thinking quickly, Gaius replied, "Don't be ridiculous. Do you think I would trust you? Jump into your arms, perhaps, but not into your heart. And then he jumped into the river below. Some accounts say he drowned on purpose, while others claim he was killed by a spear thrown by a soldier. Either way, the next morning, the Senate and Sulla paraded his body around Rome. This was no victory, though, because the Optimates had killed far too many of Gaius's supporters. There were simply too many bodies to throw in the river. Instead, they gathered the men and women, along with Gaius's surviving son, and threw them all into a pit that was later covered over pit. It's impossible to know exactly how many people died during Gaius's revolt. Estimates range anywhere from a few thousand to more than 10,000. Whatever the number, it was a massacre that shocked even the Romans, the greatest city in the Mediterranean. And the worst part was that none of it had to happen. All throughout the episode, you heard me mention the word betrayal, because that's what this is all about. The betrayal of trust between the populares and the Optimates. What began as a disagreement about land reform ended in bloodshed and the destruction of Rome. Gaius never had a chance. The moment the Optimates decided to use the Senatus Consultum, he was doomed. It was a brilliant move by the Senate. They turned the tables on Gaius and took away his power before he could use it. Then when he defended himself, the Romans sided with the Optimists. Ultimately, Gaius was killed by his own general and drowned in the Tiber River. Rome would never be the same after this. This victory for the Senate led directly to Sulla's dictatorship and the decline of the Roman Republic. But I'm getting ahead of myself. There's still plenty of Rome left to cover. We have 2 more parts to this series, plus dozens of other videos, and we release new episodes every single week. Don't miss out. Subscribe for free and join our growing community. And as always, if you want to see more, visit our website for exclusive videos and other fun stuff. We even have another channel that you can subscribe to for even more content. And if that's not enough, we have a podcast. That's right, our podcast. You can listen to us talk about Rome wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you all so much for watching. Special thanks to our supporters, whose names you can see on screen right now. You're helping us grow and produce more content than we ever could have imagined. And if you want to join their ranks, you can find the links to our support page in the description below. Until next time, thank you all so much for watching, and remember, Rome wasn't built in a day. Well, here we are, at the end of our tour through the most tumultuous century of Roman history. And if you've been with me every step of the way, I want to thank you, because I am pretty sure that I would have gotten lost without you. It has been an absolute pleasure to share this journey with you, and I hope that you've learned something along the way. But now, it is time for one last hurrah, before we put away our sandals and togas, and get back to real life. So let's spend some time with the 2 brothers who died trying to save Rome from itself, Gaius and Lucius Cornelius Scipio. We're going to start this chapter with a quote from the philosopher Cicero, who said that, even though the Gracchi were dead and gone, many of their ideas reappeared in later Roman politics. This is an apt observation, because the Gracchi weren't just reformers whose ideas failed to take root. They were the seeds themselves. They embodied new ways of thinking about how Rome should be governed, and what kind of people should be allowed to participate in that governance. And I think that it's fair to say that the brothers had good intentions. They really wanted to improve the lives of the common people of Rome, and to address the social ills that had been growing since the end of the Republic's expansion overseas. But their methods were problematic, to say the least. I mean, Gaius literally went rogue after his first term as tribune, and unleashed a reign of terror on anyone who opposed him. He killed 4 men with his own hands, and probably would have killed more if he hadn't run into a woman. That's a fact. According to Plutarch, when he was in the act of killing a 5th man, he was stopped by the intervention of a Vestal Virgin. You know, one of those priestesses who were only allowed to serve in the temple of Vesta, and weren't even allowed to get married. Apparently, she flung herself at his feet and begged him to spare the life of her brother, who was next on his list. Now, I don't know if this story is true, but it makes for a great anecdote about the kind of opposition that the Gracchi faced. And that's important because it leads us to our second point of connection with the Gracchi. They directly inspired later leaders, particularly the great Julius Caesar. I mean, there's this famous story about Caesar reading the Philippics of the elder Cato while he was crossing the Rubicon River. You know, that pivotal moment when he decided to march on Rome and seize power. And in these speeches, Cato had denounced the Gracchi and everything that they stood for. So for Caesar to read these criticisms and then ignore them was basically a symbolic rejection of the old order and an embrace of the future. More than any other Roman, Caesar embodied the break between the Republic and the Empire. and so the Gracchi stand as his intellectual precursors. Now, it is worth mentioning that they were not alone in wanting to reform Rome. There was a steady stream of tribunes in the late Republic who tried to address the concerns of the common people. But the Gracchi were different because they cared less about incremental change and more about bold strokes that would transform Rome from top to bottom. And that's why the Gracchi stand as both a symbol of hope and a warning. On the one hand, they represent the possibility of sweeping change and a better world for ordinary Romans. But on the other hand, they embody the limits of that possibility. The idealism of the Gracchi collides head-on with the entrenched power of the Roman aristocracy, and the result is inevitable. Their ideas would live on, but the brothers themselves would die, setting the stage for the final collapse of the Republic and the rise of Augustus. I think that this is best illustrated through the story of Gaius's assassination. When he ran for re-election as tribune, he was opposed by a man named Marcus Junius Brutus, who happened to be the great-uncle of that other Marcus Junius Brutus. You know, the guy who stabbed Caesar to death. Anyway, young Brutus accused the Gracchi of being tyrants and said that Rome would be better off if they were both dead. So in response, Gaius had him put on trial and sentenced to death. Now, this was actually perfectly legal. The tribune had the authority to put people on trial without a vote from the assembly and sentence them to death if they were found guilty. But it was unprecedented. No one had ever used this power to settle a political score before, and so when Gaius had Brutus put to death, it shocked everyone. In fact, even Cicero admitted that it made him gasp out loud when he heard about it. Now, the optimists might say that this showed how powerful the Gracchi were, but I see it as a crack in the dam. This was the first instance of political violence in Rome, and it opened the floodgates. If the tribunes could kill people simply because they disagreed with them, then anyone was vulnerable, and the norms of Roman politics would never be the same. This brings us to the heart of the matter, the way that the Gracchi handled themselves and their opponents. You see, Gaius was convinced that anyone who opposed him was a public enemy and needed to be treated accordingly. And he wasn't talking about political debate. I mean, he killed at least 4 men in single combat, including the aforementioned Marcus Junius Brutus and a man named Publius Sulpicius Rufus, who was a former consul and one of the wealthiest men in Rome. And he didn't stop there. In fact, according to Plutarch, Gaius unleashed a reign of terror on anyone who opposed him, killing 4 men with his own hands and terrifying the entire Roman Senate. Imagine being a senator and hearing that the tribune is running around killing people. Like, that's not exactly a reassuring thought. But again, to hear the Gracchi tell it, they were simply defending themselves against the enemies of the state. Lucius was much the same, and maybe even worse, because he took it to the streets. While Gaius was in the army putting down a revolt in the province of Sicily, Lucius unleashed a pogrom against the equestrian class in Rome. Remember that this class was growing in power and wealth, but that didn't make them popular. In fact, the equestrians were generally despised by the common people of Rome, who saw them as greedy and corrupt. So Lucius appealed to this resentment and unleashed a mob against them. They went crazy, killing hundreds of equestrians and destroying their property. And this is where things got really ugly. Not only did the mob kill a few senators, but they also dragged a few living senators to the Tiber River and threw their bronze statues into the water. This was an open rebellion against the Roman elite. And to make matters worse, Lucius defended it. He called the mob a force for good, and said that Rome would be better off without all of the corruption of the Senate. Now, the thing is, this isn't an accurate assessment of the situation. Sure, the Senate was filled with corrupt people, but that didn't mean that it was completely corrupt. Most senators were decent men who wanted what was best for Rome. But you wouldn't have known that from listening to the Gracchi or the mob. Everything was black and white. Anyone who opposed them was an enemy of the state. And that meant that there was no possibility of compromise or cooperation. They had painted themselves into a corner, and there was no way out. It gets even worse when you consider their mother, Cornelia. She was the mother of the Gracchi, but she was also the sister of 2 very influential men, Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus and Appius Claudius Pulcher. Tiberius was a reformer like his sons, but unlike them, he was willing to work within the system. He served in the Senate and worked closely with the Optimates, the faction that dominated Roman politics, and that made him very popular. The people loved him and wanted him to be king, but he refused. He didn't want to be king, and he certainly didn't want his sons to be kings. He wanted them to be statesmen, men of letters and culture, educated and refined. In fact, Cornelia was so proud of her boys that she bragged about it to everyone. That's why she became known as the mother of the Gracchi. But here's the thing. Cornelia never bragged about their accomplishments or their political achievements. She bragged about their education, about their culture, and their refinement. And that's why it's so ironic that they turned out to be such monsters. Their mother, who was known as the mother of the Gracchi, had wanted her sons to be civilized, educated men. But instead she had raised them to be bloodthirsty killers. And that's the legacy of the Gracchi. The idea that civilization and barbarism are only skin deep. Now, as always, if you want to keep exploring ancient Rome, you can do that right here. This channel is dedicated to bringing you the best in historical documentaries, series, and specials. Just look under the history section, and you'll find all kinds of awesome content waiting for you. So thanks for joining me on this journey through the Gracchi, and through the fall of the Roman Republic. I'll see you again soon. Before we get into this chapter summary, I want to do something a little different. Every Sunday, if you follow along at home, you may have noticed that instead of releasing a new episode of History's Greatest Mysteries, or Tales of Ancient Worlds, we release an all-new original series called Adventures in Odyssey. This is a serialized biblical fantasy drama following the adventures of John Egun, young man who's just discovered he's the prophesied deliverer. Join him and his friends on their quest to rescue the lost tribes of Israel and bring them back to the one true God. And now, let's get into our Chapter 10 summary. In the last episode, we left off with Tiberius Gracchus, having just been named Tribune of the Plea, giving him sole authority over the laws of Rome. Now, though most of Rome's elite were happy to go along with Tiberius's agrarian reform, which redistributed land from the rich to the poor, there were plenty of influential figures who opposed the plan. First was his own father, the consul Marcus Licinius Crassus, who told Tiberius that if he tried to redistribute land, he would be breaking the law because land once bought could never be taken away. And so, Tiberius had no right to take land from its owners and give it to someone else. Secondly, there were a number of wealthy landowners who stood to lose a lot of money if Tiberius went through with his reforms. They lobbied behind the scenes, hoping to convince the Senate to strip Tiberius of his powers as tribune of the Plea. And lastly, there was Marcus Octavius, another former tribune of the Plea, who had tried and failed to pass similar reforms 10 years earlier. He felt humiliated by Tiberius's success where he had failed and vowed to make his life hell. Tiberius, though, was ready for them. He knew that the Roman elite would try everything they could to stop him from helping the poor. So he went ahead and passed his reforms anyway, redistributing land and lowering taxes. And then he went after the corrupt tax collectors. He publicly listed every Roman senator and knight who profited from collecting taxes, and gave them a choice. Either turn over your documents proving your ill-gotten gains, or leave Rome with your head on your shoulders. Soon, thousands of Romans who had exploited the common people for their own profit were driven out of Rome, never to return again. And soon, the treasury was overflowing with the taxes that these greedy parasites had collected from the common folk. Tiberius then used this new revenue to fund his brother Gaius's plan to rebuild Rome. The city was filthy, with open sewers, trash piled up everywhere, and only one aqueduct providing fresh water. But now, thanks to Gaius's plan, several new aqueducts were built, bringing fresh water to every part of the city. Public bathrooms were built throughout the city, with free baths for everyone, and trash was collected daily and taken out of the city. Streets were repaired, and public buildings were refurbished. All across Rome, the common people rejoiced, shouting, "Hail, the brothers Gracchus," as they walked through the streets. But not everyone was happy. Those who lost their money during the redistribution of wealth were furious with the Gracchi brothers, as were the greedy tax collectors who had fleeced the common folk for so many years. And though the treasury was indeed full, the Senate didn't like how the Gracchi brothers spent the money without asking them first. The brothers were summoned before the Senate and ordered to explain themselves. Tiberius argued that he was acting on behalf of the whole Roman people, and what was good for the people was also good for Rome. But the Senate disagreed, saying that the redistribution of land and aqueducts and baths and other public works were none of the plebeians' business. They were just poor, uneducated country bumpkins who should be grateful to the Senate for letting them live in Rome at all. They accused Tiberius and Gaius of hubris, and said that Gaius, as a patrician, should not side with the rabble. Then they declared both Gracchus brothers enemies of the state, and ordered their arrest. The brothers escaped, fled to the countryside, and raised an army to take back Rome. But before they could march on the city, Tiberius was killed in battle, probably assassinated. Gaius was devastated when he heard about his brother's death, but he continued on to Rome, leading a group of 2,000 men against the city. He stormed the city, killing anyone who opposed him. And eventually, he made it all the way to the Senate, where he found the men responsible for his brother's death. He cut them down one by one, but the Optimates, the most powerful political group in Rome, were prepared. They had armed 200 senators and 800 knights to defend the Senate. And Gaius and his small band of supporters were soon overwhelmed and killed. Gaius's dream of reforming Rome was dead, and the Senate, breathing a sigh of relief, promptly forgot about the brothers Gracchus, choosing instead to celebrate their victory by throwing a feast. In fact, they celebrated so hard that the next day, citizens arriving to work at the forum found the senators too drunk to do anything, forcing them to close the Senate for the day. But though the Gracchi brothers did not live to see it, the reforms they enacted did change Rome forever. Over the next few decades, land and tax reform became standard practice, as did building projects that improved the lives of the average Roman citizen. In fact, the improvements that Gaius envisioned for Rome did eventually come to fruition, as Rome became the most opulent city in the world. But the brothers who started it all paid the ultimate price, dying believing that nothing had changed at all. So now that we've gone through chapter 10 of the history of Rome, I'm going to close out the episode with a soft, gentle reflection on the main characters from this chapter, the Gracchus brothers. Who were the Gracchus brothers, and why are they important? Well, they were important because they had the courage to stand up to some of the most powerful people in the ancient world, and they did it not for personal gain, but for the benefit of others. Both Gaius and Tiberius cared deeply for the common folk, and wanted to improve their lives by any means necessary. Though born into a wealthy family, they refused to let that get in the way of doing what they thought was right. And even when faced with the opposition of nearly the entire Roman elite, they still pushed forward, enacting reforms that directly helped thousands of people. Though they ultimately died believing that nothing had changed, Rome would never be the same. The fact that these two brothers dared to challenge the status quo inspired generations of Romans to come, showing them that even the mighty Roman elite could be challenged and defeated. And that's kind of amazing. So we got to ask ourselves, how can we be more like the Gracchus brothers? Well, for one thing, we can remember that sometimes you have to stand up against injustice, even if you don't think you can win. You know, the Gracchus brothers didn't set out to become martyrs, but in the end, that's exactly what they did. They simply saw a wrong and refused to stand idly by. And I think we can learn a lesson from that. Secondly, we can learn from the example that it's okay to work towards big goals. When Gaius and Tiberius took office, they had big dreams for Rome, but they put those dreams into action. And in doing so, they made Rome better for everyone, even if they didn't get to enjoy it themselves. And finally, we can learn from the Gracchi that sometimes you need to be willing to sacrifice everything for what you believe in. These two brothers put everything on the line, risking their careers, their reputations, and ultimately their lives, all for the sake of the Roman people. And that takes a certain kind of courage. So what's the lesson here? Well, I think we can all agree that the Gracchi brothers were pretty amazing. They were brave and compassionate and selfless. And in the end, they paid the ultimate price for standing up for what they believed in. But their story reminds us that sometimes that's what it takes to make the world a better place. It takes courage, compassion, and a willingness to sacrifice. But if we're willing to pay that price, we can make the world a better place, just like the Gracchus brothers did. And that, my friends, is a great way to live. And that's it for this gentle reflection. I hope you enjoyed this summary and reflection on chapter 10 of the history of Rome. If you did, please subscribe to my channel so you never miss an episode. And be sure to check out the links in the description for additional resources on this episode. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.